Welcome back to the inventory tutorial, and this is going to be a second part where we're just going to be adding some functionality. So you have to follow the first part. In my case, this is the same project as following the 3D one as well, but we're just going to be continuing the original 2D inventory, the first video that I made. It'll be linked below if you haven't seen it before, and let's get straight into it. So the first thing I'm going to be going over today is making some added functionality. Things like double clicking on items will regroup them all together. Currently, if I remember correctly, if we go and move an item, we see it where it was before. We're going to remove that as well. Then we're going to add item types. We're going to add a quick access bar, and I'm going to show you how to add some, let's say, equipment slots, let's say. So let's get into it. So the first thing we want to go ahead and do is in our widget, in the item, very simply, we're going to go and change how the drag and drop works. And it's going to be very, very quick. And so also for those who haven't followed or didn't see in the comments, there was a little issue with the swapping. And so I made a modification here. I'll leave it on the screen for a second just so everybody can see. And this is how you would swap if you drop an item on top one of the other. So for moving the item around, inside of our onDrag detected, this is how we currently do it. So to make it so that when we move an item, it actually disappears from its previous location, it's very simple. We give this a bit of space. We set this to hidden, and it's no longer visible. And we want to create a widget. And the widget we're going to create is going to be our UMG item. Make sure we get our key here and our structure here because we're in the same item anyway. Want to use the same one. And we simply go and say plug this right into the default drag visual, remove the self, and just with that we can now move our items around. And normally at least we should move them around and we don't no longer have the original one before and doesn't reappear, so it's moving correctly. So next what we want to do is we want to make it so that if we double click on an item, it will drag them all back together. So in the case where we go and pick up two of these and split them all up, if we double click, they'll all merge into one thing as long as there is enough space. Let's do that. So this is going to take place in the item once again. And so for this, it's rather simple. What we want to do is we want to create a double click. And for a double click, we simply want to search in here for exactly that. In our override functions, we have something for double clicking already. Now to make this easier, we will use an event dispatcher so that we can send it to the inventory grid so that it can manage all of that because we don't have the references we need here. So we get our affecting button, which is in essence checking which key we're using. So we check whether it is left click because we don't want to do this with any other one, just left click. Put a branch right here. And one other thing we want to check is obviously we don't want to be able to double click if we are full. If the item or this item is already full, we don't want to add any more to it. So we're going to, from our gets, get the max and get the quantity and check whether they're superior, whether max stack is superior to get quantity, which will then return. We can actually collapse this to a function because I think we're going to use it a few more times. So collapse this by right clicking to a function, and the function is going to be is full. And we can just turn this to a pure cast. Plug it in the getters as well because that's what it's going to be used for. Compile. And so on true, meaning that we're not full. So sorry, so this is not fully stacked, let's call it. There we go. So if it's not fully stacked, then it returns true. And so on mouse button, double click, we can go here and say, we'll call our new function. But just to test that this is working, we can add a print. Make sure at the end we put this is handled. Plug this in here. And now if we play and we double click on our item, it doesn't get called. The reason it's not working is because that's fully stacked. Now it's working correctly. There we go. So that's just me being stupid. So on the return node on the false, we say that it's handled. But on the top side, we want to also call handled, but we need to call our event dispatcher. And so the event dispatcher is going to be called item merged, and it's going to take in self as a input. So call it this because self isn't valid. We can't call things self. and we're looking for a type of UMG item. Connect that, call it here, and get a reference to, well, self this time. Plug this into the return, and we are done inside of here. Now what we need to do is in our inventory grid, we need to do the same thing that we did here and with all our other ones, and tell it to merge these items. So let's go and set that up. So from here, double click to get another reroute, call bind event to merge, to item merged, plug this in. And the next step we need is create event right here. And we need to create a new event for this. So create event, and the event we're going to make is going to be called item merged. Now, for merge items, what we need to do is we need to go through every item and add them all together. So to do that, we're going to start off by getting our items. Now, this time we don't need to know which key they are. That doesn't matter because we're just going to say remove them if they're consumed. So we want to get our values here. And with our values, we're then going to remove the one that we currently have. So we're going to promote this to a local variable first, which we'll call L items. And we still need to be aware that these are not the specific type that we're looking for here. So we have to check against the data asset. But first we want to remove self. And the reason we need to do that is because otherwise we would be adding the current value of the item we're clicking to itself, which we don't want. So we get this, plug it in here. And next we need to check whether we can do this. And so to do that, we're going to use a while loop this time, because we're going to keep going until either we've reached the end of our inventory or until we've reached the end of our space. So there's no more room in this item. So we get a reference to this. We check is not fully stacked. So while this is not fully stacked, and what we're going to make here is we're going to need an index. So let's just do that very quickly. We're going to make an index that will count throughout our loop, and will tell us whether we've reached, well, the end. So this is going to get incremented here. Just a second, grab it here. And because we're going through this loop here and we're going through the items, we simply need to check whether index is inferior to the length of our items. So let's get that here. And so if it remains inferior, we keep doing our while loop. Otherwise, we cancel and it's completed. So plug this into the condition, and now we can get into the actual loop itself. So first we need to increment, obviously, and then we can move on to making a little variable so we can check the current item, let's call it. So get our item, get our index, or items and index, and we're going to say get item, and promote this to a variable which we will call L current item. We're then going to use this to check whether the current item we're looking at is the same data type as this item that we're double clicking. This get data assets from our getters that we made last time, and the same thing here, get data assets, and we're just going to check whether these are double equal. So if they are, that means that we can consider this item to be valid to be added to the new one that the new one in quotation marks that we're making. So what we need to do here is we need to add these up. So we're going to do this in a sequence. So the first thing we want to do is we want to modify our current one. So this, not the current, but this one here. And we're going to say update quantity. So update quantity is what we have to do here. There's no choice. But what we need to do before I forget, because this can be an issue sometimes, we need to go and clamp this, obviously, because in the event that the value we have adding is superior to the max, and we need to make sure that it stays at the max. So to do that, we get our max stack. But what we really need to do, and this is something that I struggled with sometimes before, is we need a variable here. We can't just calculate, because in logic it's current item get the quantity plus this item get quantity is equal to updated quantity, right? But the problem is if you do that and then you use that same formula down here to update, to subtract from the old one, you'll get an invalid result because it's been updated. The quantity is no longer the same. So to do that, we need to first save the variable here. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to say promote to local variable. And it's going to be L sum value, we'll call it. And we can plug this in here because that's what it's going to be used for. But we want to make sure that we set it here first. So the value we're going to set it to is simply, as I just mentioned, the sum of this, of current and this item. So get this, get quantity, and we're then going to do the same thing, but instead we will use current item. Plug it here, add these two up, and then simply connect them in some value. Next thing we need to do now that we've done our modified quantity, because right now it is going through and saying, well, add them all together. Now we need to tell it, well, hey, there's no more any left in the current item. So we need to get rid of the current item. So that's what we're going to do here. So we're going to start with the branch, which is going to check whether it's superior or not and should remain. So we need some value minus this. Sorry, if I can just right click, there we go, this. Get max stack, because that's the maximum that could possibly be here. And so we then subtract that. And if this is inferior or equal to 0, then what we want to do is we want to get our current item, so our current item here, and say remove item, because that means that we've consumed it entirely when merging these ones together. If that's not the case, then we want to say update quantity. That means that in this case we've reached the maximum, and so that here we need to just update it. And in doing so, we will also break out of this loop because it's now fully stacked. So what we do to do that, simply same formula as here, copy paste it and plug it into the new quantity. There we go. Compile and save, and now we should have the result we were looking for. So right here we have 50, it's not going to work because it's already fully stacked, but if we split it up in as many parts as we want and we double click, the 50 merge back into that same spot. We can add a second one just to test. If we split these up, we can double click, it'll put 50 and it will drain whatever it could from here, but the rest didn't work. If we double click again. Okay, so one of the things we can avoid here, because as you can see, if we double click here, it doesn't exactly work very well. Because the reason is it's going and finding, and here, for instance, if I double click, it's going to realize there's 50 there, take the 50 that's left and put it here. We don't really want it to do that, right? We want it to take from whatever's not full. So to do that, we simply have to go and check in our inventory grid here. When talking about our items, we add and here, plug this here as well. And the condition is very simply, if our current item isn't full. So is not fully stacked is true. If both of these conditions are true, then we can actually go ahead and take the item. So if we try that again, we shouldn't have the same results. Even if we click in the middle here, we get our both 50 stacks, no problem, no bugs whatsoever. So let's move on to the next part, which is going to be a bit more complicated and going to have a lot more modifications and new functions to make. So let's get into it. So the first thing we're going to do next is the quick equip. So what I mean by this is if we shift click an item and there's a hotbar, which we'll make also in a second, then the item should automatically move to a slot available there. So to do that, the first thing we need to do is we need to make a second inventory, or at least in our inventory here, we need a second one to inform it that, hey, there's extra space. Let's do that. One other thing we can do first is in our actor component, we've currently got a size of 55. So we're going to bring that down to 35. So it's a bit smaller so that we have more space to work with the other inventory. So with that in mind, we open our UMG inventory and we can make this a bit smaller now. So let's put it to 300 on the bottom. And we can simply duplicate this and call it hotbar or quick access if you prefer. Yeah, quick access is probably better. So for this one, same location, we're going to put it at 100 on both sides. So it's the same length, 100 on both sides, sorry. But we want it to be 0 at the bottom, and we want it at the top to be, I think 500, no, a bit more than that, 700 will do. So it's pretty much one extra line. And so by default, this actually won't do anything, because if we run it right now, we haven't called it to set up, because it doesn't have any reference to set up upon. So that's what we need to work on now, because There's a few ways to do this. I'm going to show you both ways, at least in my mind, we can do this. One, for the inventory, we have our inventory here. We can make a second inventory of such. Obviously, this is all code, so the player won't recognize this. But there, we can do it with two inventories, or we could have it be that specific keys are used for specific items. So we're going to do both of those, just so I can show you how it works. The first one we're going to do for quick access is going to be a second inventory. So inside of our actor component, we're going to go and make that second inventory. So we can duplicate that, and it will be called quick access as well. So now that we have our quick access, we now have a second inventory we can use to share. So I'm leaving it an instance editable so that we can see it if we need to test anything. But now we can immediately go back to our UMG inventory, and I'm going to make a few changes because I realized having our stuff all on event dispatchers in here would get a bit tedious, because currently right now we only have one inventory, but if we have multiple ones it gets a bit more complicated because we would need 3 of these for each of our different inventories like quick access. So to avoid that, we're just going to do something a bit different here. We're going to change this from having a reference just to these to having a reference to itself, to our AC inventory. So in our UMG inventory, we want to call as AC inventory, and this will be of type AC inventory. So object reference part save. We want it to be instance editable and exposed on spawn. We want to compile that, and now if we go back to our AC and refresh this node, it'll appear right here. So call it self, and now we also have a reference to, well, this item here. So we don't really need these 3 anymore, but we'll leave them here for now. So back in our UMG inventory now, what we want to do is we want to start by, well, making our grid, making our quick access visible. So to do that, same thing as here, we're going to say create background. Now, what we can do to make this easier, instead of having to do it this way every time, because we're talking about a quick access biome, we're always going to say it's limited to 10, let's say, like in Minecraft, for instance. What we can do is in our inventory grid, we can make these exposed by clicking on the eye icon or clicking on instance editable. What this does is inside of our UMG inventory, we can simply click on this here, say that you're going to be 10 in size, max row of 10, and as long as we tell it to construct with our create empty, it'll do exactly that. So if we plug this like this, and now we play the game again, we should have a visible inventory below, no problem whatsoever. Currently now it's still visible. It's visible, but it's still empty because we don't have this right here. We haven't told it what to do with this. So to do that, same thing. Now that we have these, obviously allow duplicates in this case is true, and we shouldn't. And we can also, expose that as well if we want by going here, expose that, and back in our UMG inventory, we make sure to tell it that it's true, that they are allowed. So moving on, now that we have our as AC inventory, we can simply get our quick access and return this here and say, I think we get keys. Yep, just like here, we get keys. Now, one thing we can do here is we can collapse this to a macro, so that way we don't have to copy paste it everywhere. So we'll call it get quick access. And the reason we are doing this as a macro and not a function is because when we do it as a function, it's not a pass by reference, meaning that whenever we change, let's say add here, this will change the actual reference in here. But if we do it by using a function, it will consider it as a different reference. It won't be a reference to the actual player inventory itself, but rather a copy of it. So it won't change the original, let's say. So that's the reason we use a macro here, and we'll be doing the same thing for the one right here once we get around to updating it. So we can compile, and now let's go and make our for each loop here. And we'll set it all up first, and then we'll move on to the next part. So this time, instead of UMG inventory, we're using the UMG quick access, and we will say add item to grid. Same thing as usual. We can actually just copy this copy this and get our array element, plug the value in, plug this into key, and obviously we can't use our widget here. We want to use our quick access. So there we go. Now obviously if we run this, nothing's going to change because we have no items in there. But just to test it, what we can do is in our AC inventory, we can go into quick access and make one. So index 0, put quantity of 5, and we'll call it the cube. We'll put it as a cube. So if we now go and play, press tab, we do indeed have it. We can move it around, move it here as well, no problem. But it's not getting deleted because we haven't set up any references for all that in the inventory. So that's going to have to be the next part. So back in our UMG inventory, we now need to modify how this works. So to do that, what we'll do instead of doing this, because now we actually have a reference directly to our actual AC inventory. So what we do for this is we do the same thing as we did here, but this time we're going to do it a little bit differently. So we click on our quick access and we have our functions. So we click on both of them to make them appear. And so to do this, what we want to do is we want to get our quick access, going to get a reference here, and we're going to say add an item. Remove an item here. This is what we're doing here. Remove item. Plug this in right here. Plug this one in here. And then we'll do the same thing for the add. So add item right here. And reroute this here. Okay, so for now this is okay. Once we add the hotbar, we'll actually have to do a bit more than just this, but for now it's okay. So right now, normally if we go ahead and play, we have our 5 here. If we move it here, it's no longer there. If we move it back, it's here again because it's saved. And that's the advantage of doing this in the way that we did it with a grid separately, is that very easily we can just add a new inventory without a problem. There's not much difficulty here, at least. And at least I don't find it very difficult. It's much easier than having to go through the whole process once again just to add a new inventory. So, but that's all nice, but currently we still have no quick equip or sending an item to a quick access without dragging it there. So to do that, we need to do a bit more functionality inside of the inventory grid. So what we need to know is we need to know, well, what kind of target are we talking about here? Because shift clicking an item and telling it to go to quick access is nice, but what is quick access? So we need to inform it what that is. And so to do that, we'll add an array of UMG inventory grids that's going to be publicly exposed. So what we'll call this is quick equip, and it's going to be of type, well, inv for inventory and grid. So the same one that we're actually currently in. We can also, a trick found out, if you want to change this from array to a normal variable, you can right click and it'll do that as well. So we right click here to swap it to an array, make sure it's exposed. And so what this does is inside of our inventory, we can see now that right here, we have our quick equips. So if we click here, we can actually select which one we're talking about. So in the case of our actual inventory, well, if we shift click from our quick access, we want it to go to the inventory. Or if we do the opposite, we want it to go from here to here. So we select quick access. In quick access, on the other hand, we want to select the inventory grid, because if we shift click here, it should go here. Now, if we want, once we're done with all this, we're going to do the same thing, but for other grids, like grids, for instance, for item, for equipments. In that case, we're just simply going to add them to the same list, just higher up on the list. And that way they'll be selected first. If there is a space, then they'll go there. If not, they'll just go to the inventory. So to get this to work, we need to go into our item, because that's where this happens. That's where we click, and we need to set that up. So in our mouse click here, inside of our mouse button down here, instead of double click, just mouse button down, very simply, we have all these right here for the different events, for the drag and drop, etc. Now what we want to do is, if we left click, so like here, we want to add another branch. And what this branch will do is simply tell us if a key is down. So if it is not, if it is down, we'll be doing a different event. If it isn't, we'll simply be dragging like we did originally. So to check this, we want to get controller of the player controller. And we're going to check whether is input key down. And so if input key is down, then we simply say, well, if it's, let's say, shift in our case, then we're trying to perform a shift click, which will quick equip an item. So in that case, we need a new event to do exactly that, which will be called quick equip. It'll be of type this or self, so call it this again. And the type is UMG item, just like we had previously. Drag it here, call it, and we simply want to plug our self into this, and we will return that it was handled correctly. Now that we're done here, now that we know, we can run a test here just to see if it's doing it correctly. If we pick up an item and we shift click, we get hello. If we just click it normally, nothing happens. If we drag, it still drags, no issues there. So we can close that. And now we just need to set up our quick equip again. So inside of inventory grid, we need to go back to our add item to grid, and we need to add another event just like here. So give it a bit of space, double click again, and call bind event quick equip. Connect this up to the execution pin, create an event, and once again we need a new event for this, so create a matching function, and this is called item quick equip. Make sure we go back in here just to line it up nicely. And now in our quick equip, we can start doing the logic for it. So the first thing we need to know is we need to know what structure we're talking about here, because we need to know if an item can actually go in. Now, currently, we don't have much difficulty here as far as that goes, because we simply need to add an item in and no problem there. But the problem is we also need later to take into account things like the item type, because if we shift click to the equipment, if it's not an equipment, then it shouldn't be able to fit there. But for now, we're going to ignore that. We'll come back to it in a bit. In addition, we also want to make sure that when we call an item, if we shift click it and there's already an item in there, but it's not fully stacked, we can add that to the stack itself. So we're going to need to create a new few functions here, but we'll make them as we go along, and it'll hopefully make more sense that way. So the first thing we want to do is we want to get our structure here, and we want to promote it to a variable. So, or a local variable, sorry. L structure will do. We don't need something too complicated in the name. And what we want to do here is next we'll need to make our item type here, but we're going to leave it for now. So the next thing we want is we want to know which quick equip inventory grids we can use. So we put a for each loop with exactly that. And here is where we can say whether this item is allowed. So for now, we're going to put a branch here. We're going to leave it on true because we'll come back in a bit and add an actual function here for the item typing. So next part right here, we're going to need a brand new function in here in this actual blueprint, and it's going to be a function we will call find spot for item. It's going to take in the structure and it's going to return a remainder. So how many of the item is left. So this is remaining, and this here is the structure. So the structure is going to be st inventory of type, and this will be an integer. I'm not sure why it's so small, but let's just make it a bit more readable. There we go. So back in our quick equip, let's just call that function here, and we will simply plug in our local variable that we made to the structure. Now, when I say find spot, in reality, this function will not just find the spot, but will also add the item to that spot directly, if I remember correctly. Yeah, so that's exactly what it does. And the reason is just because it would be more difficult to go through each of those in the event there's multiple spots needed. So we just don't do it separately. At least that's the thought process I went through. So we want to break this so that we know exactly separately and we don't have to keep calling references. This is the quantity. That way we can also modify the quantity by telling it in the actual loop that we're going to have in a second, going through the different keys, if we can actually how much is left. So data asset is the same thing. Promote to data asset so we can compare it more easily later. Okay, so next we want to get a reference to our grid inventory. We want to get our keys, and with our keys we're going to do a for each loop. So get a for each loop right here, get the array, plug it all in. And we then want to, as usual, find the item. And we want to get its data asset. And obviously we don't need to check this branch here because we're going through the actual loop itself, and a key doesn't exist if it doesn't have an actual value. So we don't need to worry about it not being valid. Now, if this is double equal to our local variable that we made, then that means that it's considered that it is the same item. So we can put a branch here, plug this in here. And I don't think we've made this function yet, but I'm just going to check and see if we did. So add a reroute here, a bit more space. Another one here. So from here, we want to call not fully stacked. And that means that we can add some more to the stack, at least. The next thing we do need to make a new function here is we're going to call a function that actually adds the item to the item itself. So it stacks it on top of each other. So I don't think we have a function for that. So we're going to have to go ahead and make it. So in our item, we want to call add item to item. And as the name intends, that's exactly what it's going to do. It needs an input of structure. We need to know what we're adding. So item to, actually no, we just need quantity when I think about it. We just want the quantity. And so for the quantity, we're going to have it be an integer, obviously, right here. And we want to promote this. Well, actually, we want to make this a variable when we add it to the current quantity. And the reason we do this is the same thing as we did before. We need to save it before we actually subtract it. Otherwise, it will create a problem later down the line. So promote this to a variable, which we'll call temp add. Plug it in right here. Align these up. Then what we want to do is we want to call update quantity to self, because we're shift clicking the item to this one because we found it. And we want to simply clamp this value between, or we want to clamp temp add between this and our max quantity right here, our max stack. And then we want to return right here how much is left. So we simply call this right here and our temporary value right here minus, plug these two in, line them up, and connect them to the return node, and it will create an output for us. We can then go back to our inventory grid and call add item to item. And what we want to do here is we simply want to call this our quantity that we made. So L quantity right there. And so obviously, because this is going to give us how much is left, we can then promote our L quantity back to, well, how much is left. So this is the remainder as well. If this is inferior, if this is inferior or equal to 0, then we want to return here. So return here that we have 0, that there's nothing left, we're done. Now, on the other hand, this will go through all our keys. Yeah, so this will check if, first we'll check obviously here if all items in our inventory grid, if there's any that can actually stack this item on top of it. If not, then we want to go do a while loop. We want to see if there are any keys left that have enough space. So we're going to on complete, make a while loop. The while loop will take whether quantity or while quantity is superior to 0. But we also want to check whether our index that we're going to make right here by duplicating our quantity, if it's ever superior to our grid index. So we want to check whether it's ever any bigger than our grid size. Inferior. So as long as our index that we make here remains inferior to the grid size, then we can keep doing our while loop. Plug this in right here, line these two up. There we go. So obviously, if this completes, then we need to return the quantity left because that's how much we have left and we can't do anything with it in this grid. On the other hand, we can then add a sequence here by pressing S, by the way, if you don't know the shortcut. We want to, at the second one, increment our index as we usually do, right here. And then what we want to do is we want to check whether we have something at that index. So here we check whether our inventory grid contains an item at that index. Sorry, so let's line these up. And if we do, we do nothing. If we don't, then we can add item to grid at that location. Now we want to split this here because we actually need to set the value here to our L quantity, because the reason we can just immediately set this here is because it's an empty slot, and an empty slot can always fit an item. It doesn't matter which one it is, because the item itself can never be more than it can actually store, at least normally. So in that case, we don't need to bother about any subtractions or maxing out the value, because it will always be inferior to the value that it can take. The key is the index, as long as let's put it, there we go. And for the value, we need to get our structure, or get our L data asset that we saved at the beginning right here. And so here, if this happens, we simply get to set our L quantity to 0, because that means that we've added it to a completely empty slot, so it has to become 0. So with this, we finish our sub function for the quick equip. So let's go back to that whole thing. Now, if there's a remaining inferior or equal to 0, then we need to say that we are done, that we've managed to place the item, there is nothing left. So we can get a reference to this item, the one that we shift clicked, and tell it to remove the item because we no longer need it. So plug this into true. And we then call our return node. On the other hand, if this is false, then that means that we have a remainder. So we add a reroute node here. Once again, with this, we're going to say update quantity. Plug this in here, and the quantity we plug in is the remaining. And what we do now is we go to our second or third or fourth quick equip, because this is just one part of the loop, and we say, well, hey, we have this much left, let's keep going. So to inform it how much we have left, we need to get our structure here, say set members, and then plug the quantity into here. So align these up, plug this in, and there we go. So normally with this, we finished our actual loop. We'll be adding some stuff here later, make sure the condition is true or this won't work. And with this, we should be able to test if we go and open our inventory and shift click. Okay, so it's moving itself within this inventory. So let's try and figure out why that is. Yeah, so find spot for item here. We need to make sure that because it's a function in this thing, we need to make sure that the target isn't self, but the target is the quick equip that we're using, or the quick equip widget that we're trying to connect it to. So like this, make sure that you connect it. You can always just directly connect it, that works as well. Compile and save. If we now play, it should shift click down to here. Same thing here, no problem. They get saved there because they're added as a normal item would be added, and they're just removed from the other side. So that does it for the quick equip. So now we can add a bit more functionality to the whole thing. So let's go and add our item types. And now this is where it might get a bit complicated, because we're going to go a bit back and forth between a few functions, because the item equip itself needs a few different functions to, well, needs some modifications to a few functions to work, because otherwise, as I mentioned before, if we shift click something into equipment, but it's not actually an equipment, that's wrong. We can't do that. The same as if you try and swap the position between an item in the equipment and a normal item, it shouldn't be allowed to swap. So that's what we're going to be setting up. But the first thing we need to do is actually, well, make the items. So how do we differentiate the items? So very simply, right click, and we're going to make an enumerator. So an enumerator, just think of it as a way to sort information. It can be used as, treated as values like bytes on 0, 1, etc. We're gonna call it item type. And so when we open it up, we get this image. So currently it's empty. A good example of an enumerator that I completely forgot about is a line trace. So if you have a line trace, this here is an enumerator. It's just a way to show information differently than just saying 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and thinking in your mind that 0 is used for one thing. For instance, in this case, in essence, if we check double, if we want to get a reference to this, for instance, a reroute, let's say here, and we check if this is double equal, we can use 0 and 1, so we can use bytes, but we can also do the same thing with this. So that's the whole point of an enumerator. And so we're going to make our own custom one, which thankfully Unreal allows us to do, called the item type. Item type may not be the perfect word for this. Maybe slot type is better. So the type we're going to have is obviously default. So default means, well, any item can fit here. It doesn't matter. We're then going to have equipment, and we're then going to have another one which we will call armor. So this is just so we can showcase 3 different ones. You don't have to call them this. They can be whatever you want. It doesn't matter. We can close it. We don't need it anymore. That's all it needs to do. And so now we can get into actually using these and applying them. So the first thing we need to do is we need to inform our inventory grid what type of items it accepts. So in our case, we want to add a function here, or a variable, sorry. And that variable has been called slot type. Right click to make this back to a normal variable. And we're looking for e_item type. Now we want to make sure this is exposed, because in our inventory here, in our UMG inventory, we want to be able to make sure that these two are set to slot type of default. Otherwise, that means that we can't place items in it. So with that in mind, we can now move on to, well, what we want to do with them. We want to change the conditions. So to get this to work, to test this more like is probably the better way to put it, we're going to move both of these, or at least no, what we'll do is we'll make this slightly bigger by making our canvas a bit bigger, I think. Yeah, so I made mine a bit bigger, so let's just do that. We'll put it to 1600 by 800 as well. No change there. But here, we want to make this a bit smaller. So now we want the inventory itself to be 100 on the top, 100 on the left, but we want it to be 500 on the right, and we want it to be 300 like we have here, no problem. Obviously the same here, we want it to be 500 on the right. And so with that, currently if we run it, the inventory is still the same, no difference. But what we're going to do is we're going to add some new inventory here. So this we can just duplicate. We'll just duplicate the quick access, and we will call this equipment. And so equipment is going to go in the right. So we'll just move it. Let's just see what I put. So we're actually going to change how it's anchored. We'll just anchor it to the top here. We're going to put it to 1150 on the left, and on the Y we'll put it at 100, so that it lines up with our inventory here. We're then going to put 150 on the right and 100 on the Y, because we want it to be 100 by 100. That's how big our grids are. For the grid size, we want to put it to 3, because this is pretty much the dimensions for 3 items. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that we set this here slot type, instead of having it be default, we want it to be equipment. And as I mentioned previously, we want to change our quick equip here, because currently this one has none, but we want it to be that if we shift click here, it goes to quick access and then to inventory if there's not enough space. So first we select our quick access, then we select our inventory grid. So just like that. Same thing here. If we shift click, we want to prioritize going to the actual equipment, and then we want to go to the actual quick access. And the quick access will do the same. First, we want to go to the equipment, and then we'll go to the inventory. So to check if this is working correctly, what we can do is, obviously now there's no conditions, and we haven't actually made it visible. So first we'll do that. Very quickly, normally we wouldn't do it this way. We're going to change it in a second, but just to test, for the purpose of testing, we're going to get a reference to our equipment, plug it into here, because they use their same base, we can do that. And if we play now, we have our equipment as well. If we shift click from our quick access, it goes to the equipment. If we shift click again, it goes back here. If we shift click on our inventory, it should also go to the equipment, because that's the priority we gave it. It does indeed, no problem. If we shift click, it goes back to our quick access. Now this is obviously only if there's enough space, but for some reason we can't place it there. So it's a little issue there. Let's see what that is. Well, we'll see if it pops up again. If it does, we'll see if we can solve it. So let's now go into making our item types be taken into account. So the first thing we can do is we can go back to our inventory grid, and right here is where we're going to actually make a function to determine whether an item can be accepted based on its item type. So to do that, we actually need to modify our data asset, because from here we need to know what type of item we're dealing with. So to do that, we actually need to make that first. So in our data asset right here in the items folder, double click on it, and we want to open or add a new variable. Now, for those who don't know, the offset here is from the 3D tutorial, so you don't have to worry about that, it's not important. So we can call this item type, and the item type is going to be of simply our enumerator that we made called item type. Now, simply by default, we're going to leave it by default, no problem there. We then need to, we'll make one, which we'll call, let's say, well, we have a special cube here, so we'll use that. If you don't have these, just make an extra one. It's not a problem. You can either duplicate, or you can go ahead and right click, call a data asset, and search for our reference right here. So I think, yeah, I accidentally went and pressed Control Z, so that went back. So we want this to be item type. File and save. So we can go ahead and close our data asset, or data item, sorry. And we want to then go and open our special cube, or whatever you called it. And we want to change the item type from default to equipment. Now, I don't know if we have any. Here. Let's just check. I don't believe we do. Yeah, so this is a special cube. So with this, we now want to go to our UMG inventory grid. And right here, now that we have added it to our data asset, we can break our inventory. And we can get from here our item type. And we want to save this as a variable. So promote this to a local variable. L item type. Plug this in right here. We can hide unconnected, just line it all up. And we're going to need to make a new function. Function that determines based on our equip here, so based on which grid we're in, if it can accept based on its slot type. So this will be simply called can accept item. So we're going to reroute this. We're going to get a reference to our, well, we can actually add that after. We want a reference to our L item here, reroute that here, and we're going to add a double equal here, even though we're just going to do it this way. So we then want to select all this, collapse to nodes, or sorry, not collapse nodes. We want to collapse to a function, which we will call can accept item. And so this can be a pure cast, and we don't need the actual first pin because it should be based on the type, or it should be based on the reference. So here, from our array element, drag out and call can accept item, because we need to make sure that we're using this here. Otherwise it won't work. So plug in our item here, plug the return condition here, and there we go. So inside of here, it's rather simple. We simply want to say whether if this item here is equal to the slot type here. So this won't work because it's the wrong equal. There's two, so we want to make sure that we select this one right here. So if these two are equal, that means that it's the same typing, so we can just use it. But if they're not, we can also check whether the slot type here, so the slot type of this actual inventory, if it's equal to default. Because if it's equal to default, that means we accept any type of item that is placed here. So now normally, if we go ahead and try and shift click to add our item, like in our inventory here, if we try and shift click to put it here, it shouldn't work. It shouldn't, at least. So let's try and see why it is allowing that. Did we not change its type here? So you're supposed to use equipment, yet this is a special cube. So if we just put this to a normal cube and try again, that shouldn't work. Yeah, so it got added here because it's a normal cube. If we try again, it will just keep going between these two because it can't fit in there. So that's just my fault because I wasn't paying attention to the items we were actually using. The next thing we need to check is if we pick up a normal cube here, we can still drop it in here. No problem, because we haven't told it that on drop if it can accept it. So to do that, we need to know our slots need to actually know if they're allowed to accept that item. So to do exactly that, we need to go into our widgets, we need to go into our inventory slot, and we need to make a few changes. So one thing we can do, although no, we'll do that in a second, we want to simply add a key here, or a new value, which is going to be the slot type. And it's going to be of type e underscore item type. It's going to be exposed on spawn because we need to do it once we spawn this item. And in our onDrop, we need to make a slight modification, which is right here. So we're going to need to actually make a few here as we go further. But some things we need will be causing issues because of this. Because if we drop an item on the same key, so that's probably what's actually... So the reason there's an error when we do this, but no error when we do that, is because we're actually telling it to drop on keys, an item on key 0 on key 0, which is not correct. Whereas if it will happen here, if we try and put it on 2, same thing here, it won't work as well. The reason for that is because, well, we're telling it not to look for the key. And so because it's looking for the key and it's saying, well, it's the same, we can't do it. So what we need to do is we need to add some detail to that. So we'll start by saying get data asset and comparing to our slot type. So we will get item type. And if these two are equal, not like that, this equal, then it's okay. But we also need to do the same check as before. If this is double equal to default, then it also works. So if this or this is true, then we can keep going. On the other hand, we also need to do our check here as well, but we need to add something to that. We need to make sure that either this is true, or if we get the parent of this item and we get the parent of the current item we're on, so the slot, if these two are double equal, meaning it's the same grid, no, sorry, if they're different or the keys are different, then we can actually place it. Now, another thing we also want to do is, and this is more a security than anything else, we need to check and all these three are true. We can also add an extra check just in case. Get quantity. If quantity is equal to 0, or at least if it's superior to 0, then we can perform all this. Otherwise, we should be careful not to be allowed to drop items that are equal to 0, because that would be a bug. So let's just line these all up. And so that will fix our conditions for dropping the items. Now if we go and press, if we like put this here and put it on 0, it'll work because it knows it's a different actual grid, so it has no problem with that. If we shift click, it can't go over there. If we drop it, it can't either normally. Apparently it still does. So is that because, no, we're using a normal cube here, so it shouldn't be accepting those. Oh, sorry. No, the reason it allows it is very simple. It's because we haven't told it which slot type we're dealing with yet. So in our inventory grid, we're looking for our create background, and we need to tell our background what type it is. And so that's based on the slot type right here. Plug it in, and now it will know that the slots in the top right are for equipment, so we can't place them here anymore. It doesn't let us. If we shift click, it doesn't allow us either. So no matter what we do, we can't put it in there unless it is a specific equipment, like this specific cube here, which it will allow us to add by shift clicking or simply placing it there ourselves. And obviously a special cube, which is of type equipment, can still be placed here because its default allows any item to be there. Now we need to do the same thing also for our items themselves, because we also need to know which type of item we're dealing with. Because if we go and say, we have two items here. This one is an equipment, so it can actually go in here. But if we drop this on top, we have a bit of an issue. It doesn't work. So we actually need to tell it that we're allowed to swap types. And so to do that, because even right now, if we drop this on top, it swaps, but it doesn't know what to do when it's here. So we need to tell it how to deal with that. So to do that, we need to go into our item, and in our item, we also need to know what kind of slot we're allowed to accept, or what type of slot we're placing. So we'll call this item slot type, and it's also going to be of type, well, e underscore item. Now make sure this is also exposed on spawn and instance editable. We're going to immediately go into the grid this time so we don't forget, and at the beginning of this, right click on our item widget, refresh the nodes, and it will appear here. Plug the item slot into here. And now, just to be precise, this isn't the item type here. That's not what it is. What we're trying to inform it of is we're trying to tell it, hey, this item right here is in a location that accepts these type of items. And the reason we do that is that when we try to swap items, like we just tried to do earlier, it doesn't accept it unless that item can also be accepted in this area. So that's what this is for. So in our UMG item, we're going to have to set up some stuff to take that into account. So most of that is going to happen obviously in the on drop, because that's where everything happens, and it's going to be mostly here if I remember correctly. No, sorry, no. So where it's going to happen is actually here, because we need to make a difference here, because now we can't swap all the time. We can only swap on certain scenarios. So we put a branch here. Sorry, not a branch, not an N. We want a branch here. On true, we're going to go and do the same logic that we had here. No problem there. But on false, we're going to do something else, which is going to be cancel. So we're going to get a reference to this, because same thing. And we will call on false that we just need to reset how it was before. Now the condition is where it gets a bit more complicated, let's say. We get old item, we get the data asset, and we're just going to check. So we're actually going to make our own function again here. So we want to here get our item type, and we're going to check if it is double equal, and we will reroute this. And I'm just going to collapse this node to a function, sorry, and we will call valid item type. Like that. No, need the Y. So this will be valid item type. It's going to be a pure cast, and it's simply going to check whether this can be allowed in this object. So we can go ahead and open it up very quickly, and it's going to be identical to what we did before with the actual UMG inventory, where we're going to check if this is double equal to our item slot, or if the item slot itself is equal to default. So if either of these are true, then the item is valid and we can actually place it here. So close that, we don't need it anymore. And we want to go to our on drop. So back in on drop, the first thing we want to check is there's actually a few things we need to check. First, what we need to check is if this is true and if the opposite is true. So we need to know whether if in old item, valid item type is the item type of this data asset. So we get data assets, and we can just copy this here and plug it in. If both of these are true at the same time, because if only one is true, then it doesn't work. We need to know that both are true. Or if old item data type, so we get item slot type, sorry, is the same as the other one, meaning like when we're shift clicking between the inventory and the quick access, if they're the same, then there's nothing to worry about. That means we're just talking about two identical slots, just in two different locations. So we can simply consider that this or this to be true, and then we can swap. So if we compile and save this and try it again, if we drop this item in equipment, no problem. If we try and drop this here, it disappears. So why is that? Did it get dropped? No, it didn't. So something went wrong here. I'll try and figure it out and get back to you in a second. Okay, so the issue was actually pretty simple. It's just the return node here needs to be set to true, not false. And also one other thing I realized is this logic right here for swapping is not very good. We can actually make it a bit better. So I'm just going to do that very, very quickly here by simply getting our item here, our core, both of them, attach them to the true. We get our old item for the first, we get our self for the second, or we can just leave it as is, it's fine as well. For the key, we simply want to do here, we'll call our key here for self, and we want the old item right here, and we want to get its structure, just simply get item structure from here, and plug this into the value right here. And on the other hand, for the other one, we want to get our key from the old item, plug that into value, and get our item structure here and plug that in right there. Now this will just directly create the new items. And we can then simply call remove old and remove self. And that'll do the same thing, just in a lot shorter without any extra variables here that we don't particularly need. Inside of our inventory grid, where we obviously create our items, we just have to add here, and that's in our add item to grid function. Just make sure you add this here as well if you want to add the swapping. So normally if everything's well, we can still swap items with no issues. Yep. If this one gets shift clicked there, it won't allow us to place it, so it goes back here. Now currently if we close it, it disappears, and that's because we haven't set up anything to save that variable, which is what we're going to be doing very soon once we finish going through the checks for the item types. So once I'm done with that, I'm just making sure that everything compared to my other project is correct. That way we have as little bugs as possible. So that should do it for the item. So I think that's everything as far as conditions go, if I'm not wrong, for swapping and moving items to the equipment. So the next thing we need to do is we need to actually set up the AC inventory to save our special equipment. So to do that, there's the way we did before where we created a new quick access and use that. But there's another method we can use, as what we're going to use here, is making specific values for specific items. So currently right now we have 0 to 9 dedicated to the quick access, but we can also say, if we get rid of this, that specifically 15, 16, and 17 are dedicated to the equipment slots. Now this can be any value you want, as long as you remember them and preferably keep them in a order, because otherwise it gets very, very complicated. And the problem with this, although it has its good sides, it also has a lot of difficulty, because everything we've done in our grid needs to be slightly modified now, because this was originally 0 to x, x being the grid size, but now we need to tell it, well, hey, the grid size for our UMG here is not 0 to 3, it is for instance 10, 11, 12. And to do that, we need to actually change some things. So the main change we're going to do is here. We're going to actually create a new variable in the inventory grid. So open that up. In the inventory grid, what we're going to do is we're going to, from our create background here, we're going to add an integer. And that integer is going to be the starting location. So that's going to be the start index, we'll call it. And so we want start index here, and it's going to be of type integer. And we're going to promote this to a variable. This variable is going to be called start index as well. Very simply, what we're going to do to make things easier here, so it's not as difficult, we're going to promote this grid size specifically here to a function. And we'll be calling this get grid index. Is that? Yeah, so what we'll do is we'll call it get grid index. And what this will do is very simple. It's going to take the size, so our grid size here, and instead of passing it directly on, it's going to be added to the actual start index. That way we always have the same length. It's just that we know that we start at a different index. And so for that, we're going to go through all of our references to grid size and replace them in the majority by this new variable or this new function that we made right here. So I'm going to go and look for those right now on my other screen just to make sure that we get everything correctly. So the first one we just did is in our actual create here. Then when we split the stacks, so with our right here in our split, we need to do this for loop needs to be replaced with our grid. So right here. Next is in the find spot for item. So right here, instead of using our grid size here, we need to replace it with our grid index here as well. And normally, if everything went well, we shouldn't have any more references to the grid directly. So if we do find references, we just have the one which is right here. One other thing we need to do is we need to also use our start index where it's necessary, and it needs to be in a few places. So the first is obviously when we create it, so we set it here, no problem. Then we're going to need it in some other indexes because we need to know when we split, for instance, that we don't start at index 0, we start at the start index that we made. So like this. Then we want to use the starting index again in the find spot, because we need to know instead of, so what we need to do here, and the reason we need to use it is index shouldn't start at 0. Otherwise it's a waste of resources. So what we need to do is we need to set our local variable index here to our start index before looping through our while loop. And the reason we do that is so that then we start, if let's say the starting index is 5, we'll go 5, 6, 7, 8 instead of 0 all the way to 5 to then actually start being useful. We have one last one, which is obviously going to be our get grid index, like right here, and that should be every single one we need. So now the problem is we need to now go through and tell which index needs to be started from which value. And so to help visualize this, we're going to make a small change in the inventory slot right here. We're going to go into our designer. We're going to add some text right here. And we're simply going to make it as big, or at least we're going to set it to 100 if I'm correct. Let me just make sure. So we simply want to attach this to the canvas panel as well. And we'll leave it at 100, no problem there. And we're simply going to center the text. And the text will leave at a value of, let's say, Q. We will set it valid, and we'll lower its opacity so that it doesn't really get in the way. So put it something like 0.3. And what this is simply going to be used for is just to check whether we're doing this correctly. So we simply want to say set text to, well, the key that we receive, because the key is inputted for this no matter what. So we just plug that in, and we can get to see whether we are setting this up correctly. So by default, if we just do this and we press tab, we have 0 all the way to 34, 0 all the way to 9, but here we have 0, 1, 2. And now that's not correct. We want to change that in a second. So to change that, what we need to do very simply is in our inventory UMG, so the basic one, we need to change this, because currently we use create grid background without asking any questions, but we can't do that. We need to actually use a custom one here, create grid, or at least a separate one, where we set its index to, let's say, 10. And so with that now, if we run it, it should start from 10. So we still have a problem, see? Because here it's going 0, 1 all the way to, well, a bit larger than what we want. So let's try and figure out why. I think it's because we told it here to be 3. No, so it's 3. It should still remain 3. So the problem is likely in our create right here. Okay, sorry. So yeah, so we obviously need to tell it to start from that value, otherwise it doesn't work. So once again, if we press tab now, we get 10, 11, 12. So think of it this way, we have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 for the quick access. And then we have 10, 11, 12, sorry. So I said 10 here, but 10, 11, 12 for the equipments. And this can work for however many as we want. And so what this means is whenever we call in our UMG inventory here, that we want to change our grid, or at least if we want to change our quick access right here, we need to inform it that, well, it needs to use this same quick access for the equipment. So we get a reference here to our equipment as well. And so here we can actually collapse these to a function because we're going to be copying them instead. So collapse the function, add to quick access. And right here, we'll do the same thing, collapse the function, remove from quick access. There we go. And so now here we do the same thing. We say remove from quick access. And here we can just copy it and do the same thing. And the reason this works is because, well, we don't have to worry about the key because the key is a different value compared to the normal quick access. So it's a bit easier here to manage, because you don't have to have a different one like this every time. But at the same time, we need to make some modifications here so that this actually works. So those modifications involve very simply modifying what we have here. because we can't do a for each loop here because the values are too low. So what we need to do instead is we need to use a for loop. So we're going to set that up in a second. So what we can do here, because we know the actual keys that will be used, so we can say a for loop here, we can actually get here. So what we'll do is we will make a literal int here, which is going to be the start index, which we put as 10. We'll use that here as the start index as well. And for the last index, what we can do is from our UMG equipment, we can say get quick, sorry, not get quick, it is get grid index. And the reason we can do that is because we've called this before, so we've set that value up beforehand. So we can actually also do the same thing here where we could say get start index as well. That works instead if we want to do it this way. Plug this into here, we can remove that and just put our 10 back again. And so this will go through our for loop, and we can do the same trick as we did here, just instead we don't use UMG, quick access, sorry, we use the equipment. And for the key, we use the index. And so for the find, we also use the index here instead. And normally this should do the trick for setting up this one, which will do the same result. It's just that we have to do it this way because we have no longer a for each loop that works. We actually have to do it with specific keys. So now if we run it, currently we still don't have anything saved in it, or at least apparently we do. Oh, of course, sorry, I made a little mistake. The reason this doesn't work is we have to actually be careful because currently, as you just saw, it made items even though we didn't have any items. And the reason for that is because here, the quick access only shows the keys that it has. So it will only make the items that it has. On the other hand, here, we're doing a for loop. So it will try and make them even if it doesn't have the information. So to avoid that, very simply, if we don't do the find correctly, if it doesn't find it, then we don't do anything. If it does find it, we can actually call this function. And now it's empty, no problem. If we pick up an item, well, actually we need to pick up a special one. If we drag and drop it here, it remains. Oh, so we have a little issue here for some reason. Okay, so yeah, that's also another issue. The problem is with this logic right here is this will work, but the problem is this will also do the same thing because it will also look for the items in the quick access. So we need to actually change how both of these are done. So this one is fine. Sorry, not both of them. We just need to change how this one works because of this one. Because now it's just going and finding, well, hey, we have key at 10. That's still key. So that can still be added right here. So it gets added here to the value as you just saw right here, which is below because this is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And because we maxed it at 10 here and it will go back to the beginning. So it shouldn't do this. So to tell it not to do that, we just delete this. We copy this the exact same way. But instead, well, actually, no, to be fair, we can just use the exact same thing. But the problem is we need to change this here from our UMG equipment to the quick access as well. And what we need to call instead of what we have here, we can use the same thing normally. And it should work just fine. The only problem is, yeah, we have to change the grid target. So we could make this a function. So, you know, we'll actually make this a function. And what we'll do is we will collapse this right here. So collapse the function. And we will say set up quick access map. And it needs an actual input. And so that input is going to be of type grid. And that grid will simply be connected across all of these. So we will get target actually, just to make it a bit tidier. And it should be all the way at the bottom. Plug the target into here. Make sure you disconnect these, otherwise it won't work. Plug the target here. Now, please note this only works for our quick access because of how it works, how we set it up. It won't work. You can't copy this for the inventory, obviously, for the basic inventory. So we call this here. Now this is quick access, so we plug quick access in. And we can then copy this and paste it here and do the same thing, but for the actual grid itself instead. So let's just plug this in with our equipment and it should work just fine. We should no longer have a copy of the other one. If we shift click this here, it still seems to be appearing. So why is that? Let's have another quick look to see why. Sorry, the reason is because, yeah, once again, this shouldn't be grid size. It should be grid size -1 here for the for loop. So make sure we put the -1. Now if we connect this back up, we shouldn't have any more issues. It should be just fine. Shift click that. Doesn't no longer appears at the bottom. And we now have a equipment slot that works with the quick access. We can shift click, we can split it, we can double click to rejoin them, move them around, move them from one spot to the other. If we put it back in the equipment, it gets saved, no problem. So the last thing we can do now, just to make things final, because I think some people would like this, it's not exactly part of an inventory, but it could be nice to add. Let's make a hotbar at the bottom of the screen at all times that the player can see. So to do that, we simply need to create a new widget first, because obviously we can add our grid to it, but we still need a separate one for exactly that. So go here, right click, we want a user interface, we want a widget. User widget, we'll call UMG hotbar. So let's go and move this to the right screen. We can go ahead and close these. We shouldn't need them anymore. So for the hotbar, what we want is to start with a scale box, because this is going to be on screen all the time. So we'd rather have a scale box. We then want a canvas panel, which we need to make sure for the scale box actually is set to scale to fill to fill instead of scale to fit. In the canvas panel, we then want to add a second canvas panel, which we're going to center at the bottom. So select your canvas panel, the smaller one, put it at the bottom here. We want it to be 0, -50, 1000, because we need it to have 10 items in it, 100 in height for the items. We want it to be 0.5 and 1, so that way it stands above here. Just to make it, now we can add our actual grid. And so the grid we want to add is just our UMG grid right here. Make sure you set this to fill, so it takes up all the place that it needs. And with that, we have set up the basics. What we can do as well is this is just extra functionality for you guys, is we can add text that will display the name of the item currently equipped. So just call this text box, so TB for equipped. And we can then go and say, make sure it's variable, and go to our graph. Now we can actually move into changing the things. So the first thing we want to do here is, because it's very simple, we want to get a reference to our as_AC inventory. Sorry, I made that. AC inventory. So AC inventory. Go compile and save, and make sure it is exposed on spawn, so that when we create this widget, it will be ready. So the first thing we need to do, like any of these widgets to use inventory, we need to say create grid background. Now, unlike before, we can simply leave it at 0, but we're going to actually make a small change. Is we're going to create a function here, which we'll call update hotbar, which we'll be calling every time we make a change to the inventory, so that it's done and we don't have to worry about it. Normally it wouldn't be the best way to do it, but it doesn't matter too much. So to do that, we actually need to do something first. We need to clear out the grid. So we're going to make our function, which we'll call update hotbar. And the first thing we need to do to update the hotbar is we need to clear the hotbar. There needs to be nothing in there. So with our grid, we're going to get our grid inventory. And what we want to do is we will get our values for each loop. And we're simply going to call right here, remove item. Just so you don't worry, remove item won't be removing the items from the inventory. And the reason for that is very simple. With this inventory, we're not actually going to be telling it to remove the item or what to do with the remove item. And so although this calls some extra logic, it also really cleans everything out properly, so we don't have to worry about any items remaining in here if we just say remove from parent, because that can sometimes cause some issues. So once we've cleared our original hotbar, so our original items, we then want to get our quick access. So here we're going to say get quick access, because those are the ones we need. We're then going to do the same trick as we did before. So actually we can go and open our inventory, and we'll just copy the function because it'll be much easier. Copy this and paste it right here. And so what we'll do here instead of this, the target is going to be our grid that we made here. And the find is going to be our quick access right here. And instead of this, we get our UMG inventory grid right here, plug it in like this. And also one thing before I forget, once we've plugged everything in here, we go attach this here. In our designer, we actually need to inform it what size it needs to be. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So we want it to be a grid of 10, and that's all we need. Make sure actually we allow duplicates, even though it shouldn't. No, actually, we do want to allow duplicates. Make sure you check that. And so with this, we can actually move this to our canvas panel, and we're going to center it on the top, put it 1 on the alignment on the Y, 0.5 here, and set it to 0 here. And what this will do is just make it so that it appears above the center. Make sure the text is centered as well. And we will give it a bit more on the Y by putting it at 25, minus 25, sorry. And so now currently we have this almost complete. We just need to call one last function, which is going to be called modify equipped. And this is just so we can tell which item is equipped with the text box that we just made. So to do that, we want to get a reference to our inventory. Sorry, so to actually do this, we need to make a small change in our inventory slot and also in our inventory actor component. So before we do all that, we'll actually make it visible. So in the begin play of our AC inventory, we're going to actually add this function. So, or add this widget. So create widget. And with create widget, we're going to say the hotbar. That's what we want to add. We want to add it as self. And we're actually going to promote this to a variable so we can hide it once we open the inventory. So promote to a variable we will call as UMG hotbar. Put it right here. We want to add it to viewport like this. And what we can do next is whenever we show our UMG or hide our UMG inventory, we want to set this visibility to not detectable. On the other hand, once it is visible, we want to make sure that it is hidden because we don't want to see it. So currently, if we run this, we have our inventory bar visible at the bottom. Now, if we press tab, it disappears. It reappears here, no problem. Now, the next thing we're going to add is we're going to make it so that we can actually tell which item is equipped. So to do that, we need to know which item we're scrolling over, let's say. So to do that, we want a variable we'll call equipped, which is going to be a float, not a float, sorry, an integer. And another thing we're going to need is we're going to need a new input. So we can do this with the IA, but just for simplicity's sake, keeping it short, we're going to look for mouse wheel, and we want down, and here we want mouse wheel up. So what we want to do is very simple. We want to increase it here. So we're going to increment. But what we want to make sure is if ever the increment is double equal, sorry, no, we can't do it this way. We want to check whether equipped is double equal to 9. And if it is, then we want to set this down to 0. If it is not, we want to simply increment the value. This means that we go around in a loop whenever we increment. So on the other hand, if this is the opposite, we want to go here and say if ever you're equal to 0, then we want to set you to 9. And we want to decrement the equipped item otherwise. And so by itself, none of this actually does anything. So what we want to do is we want to then add a sequence here, like this, and a sequence here as well. And what we want to call is from our UMG hotbar here, we want to say modify equipped. So connect this to both of these like this. And so what we'll do is in here, we'll be telling it which equipment that is. But one last thing we can do just to help make it really visible is we're going to add another widget here, or another image. And we're going to add it to the canvas panel right here. Make sure it's variable. We want to make it a bit smaller. So what we want it to be is, we want it to be kind of an indicator that the item is being selected. So we'll make it a bit smaller. We'll make it something like 4. And we want it to be above. So we want it to be 1 on the Y, and we want it to be -5 here. For the left, we want it to be a bit offset. So we're going to put it at something like 10 or maybe even 20. And we'll obviously take 20 or 40 off on the other side. So we'll put it to 60. So that we have something a bit centered. By default, this is going to be hidden. So make sure you set this by default hidden. Otherwise, every item everywhere or every slot everywhere will have this, and we don't want that. We want to make functions for equip and unequip. So we'll make a function for equip and one for unequip. And very simply, they're just going to take the item that we just made, and we're going to set visibility to visible, to hidden on unequip, and to visible on equip. So in equip, make it visible. And now with this, we're going to go through our loop here with our hotbar in our modify equipped, and we're going to tell it to deal with that. So how it should handle that situation. So to do that, we need to get our grid panel here, and we want to get all children. Or actually, I don't think that's even necessary, because I think we have the empty. No, we don't have our inventory slots, I think, in our grid in this project. So let me just check. No, so we don't. So that's from the other project. That's fine. So in our hotbar, what we need then to do is we need to get our grid panel, and we're going to simply go through every single value in our grid panel. So get all children, and so in this case, it's only 10 of them. We do a for each loop, and we need to check what class they are to be able to tell them what to do. So we want to get UMG inventory slot, promote that to a variable. Sorry, not promote it to a variable. And we will put a branch here. And very simply, if the branch if the array element is double equal to, from our AC inventory, our equipped key, then we want to tell it, well, this is the new equip, and so we'll tell it what to do. Now, one thing we do need to do before is we need to know which one was the previous one. So what we'll do here is we will promote this to new equipped, we'll call it. And we'll make a duplicate of it for old equipped. So this is old equipped. And we'll need a variable here to save what the old equipped key was. So we will make a previously equipped, and that'll be of type integer. And so what we'll look for is if we find that previously equipped one, so get this right here, if you're equal to one of these as well, then we're going to tell it to set that to the previously equipped one. So we'll add another reroute right here and set the previously equipped, so old equipped right here, to this. So align these up, line all of it up, there we go. And so once we've gone through our array and we know all these, we want to do a sequence. Now the first thing we want to do in the sequence is we want to tell our previously equipped, or old equipped here, make sure it's valid, because in some cases there was no previously equipped, and we want to unequip it. On the other hand, we want to get the new one, so the new equipped, and say equip that. Now this is only changing the actual visual for the slot. So the next thing we need to do is we need to tell our AC inventory to set equipped, sorry, no, we don't need to set equipped. What we want to do is we want to get our equipped here and set our previously equipped to the new one. With that, we then need to inform based on our knowledge of the previously equipped, because that's just what we did here. We want to get quick access, and we want to find the key that's associated with it. And so to set the name, we just need to check that the item is found. And if it's found, we can break, and from the data asset, we can finally get the actual name of the item and set it to our actual text box. Set text. So if it's found, we put it to that. If not, we just leave it empty. And so now if we go and play that, our text box is currently sorry, I forgot. One last thing in the hotbar on begin play, we want to simply call update hotbar. And the reason for that is just simply, it'll get rid of the text box, I think, or did we forget to call it in here? Yeah, sorry, in update hotbar, we need to call here modify equipped as well. And so now if we play, we can scroll through the actual items themselves. Now currently there's none in there. If we pick up an item, it's not in our hotbar. If we shift click them, they're not appearing apparently. So I wonder why that is. The reason the widget isn't changing here, even when we pick something up and put it in the hotbar or the quick access bar, is it notices the name because the item is in the actual inventory itself. It is like, how to put it? It finds it here, no problem. Sorry, not here. It finds the name because the name is based on the actual quick access. But the reason it's not updating visually is because in the update visual, we actually need to tell it when to update, because we don't tell it to update other than on spawn. So to update that, we simply need to go into our inventory again, and we need to modify our functions here that get called when we make a change to the quick access. So when we change the quick access in here, so here we're removing, and we get a reference to our AC inventory, we get a reference to our our hotbar, and we want to call update hotbar. So we call this here. We can then copy this and do the same thing in the add. And normally now with this, we should have it working correctly. So if we go and pick these up and we place these two, or at least these in here, we have our actual items. And if we scroll through, the names appear and we can see the item right there. Now, obviously in this inventory, we don't have the equip and unequipped, so there's no bar above, but here we do, and that's the whole point. So I hope you enjoyed. I hope this kind of gave all the extra functionality everybody wanted. There's one bit that I did want to add, but I couldn't seem to find, or at least I did try and do it, but ran out of time because it wasn't working, is that if we pick an item here, and for instance, we wanted to spread it across all these slots, I was trying to set it up, but had a few issues. So if ever I manage to get around to fixing that and getting it to work, then I'll make an extra small part for just that. But other than that, I think I covered as much as necessary. The idea, if somebody plans on asking, for setting up something like armor, you would use the exact same logic as we did here, but instead of 3, you just use 1, because you want to have just one type for each piece of armor. For instance, like if we take an example of Minecraft, where you have the head, the torso, the legs, and the boots, then you would have 4 different types, 1 for each of those, and you would just use 1 item instead of 3 like we did with the equipment. So I hope you enjoyed. For those who have managed to stick around all the way to the end, this tutorial or this project will be on GitHub starting next week, given that I'm going to be making it available for the people following the Satisfactory tutorial so that we set up the inventory in the next project. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned, or at least were able to make everything you wanted to with this tutorial. And I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.